I'm just going to start off by reading briefly Lisa Tuttle's bio here that was in the program. You've probably already read this, but it gives us a good starting place. Lisa Tuttle began writing while still at school, sold her first stories at university, won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Science Fiction Writer of the Year in 1974. She obviously wrote that at the age of 3. Her first novel, Windhaven, was a collaboration with George R.R. Martin, published in 1981. This was followed by a horror novel, Familiar Spirit, in 1983. Unable to stick to one well-defined genre, although most of her work features elements of horror and or dark fantasy, she went on to write novels of psychological suspense, Gabriel and the Pillow Friend, science fiction, Lost Futures, and contemporary mythic fantasy, The Mysteries and the Silver Bough, as well as books for children and young adults and nonfiction, Encyclopedia of Feminism and Heroines. Short stories were her first love and remained important. Her first short story collection, A Nest of Nightmares, was published in the UK in 1986 and 2 years later featured in Horror 100 Best Books, edited by Stephen Jones and Kim Newman. I mean, seriously, I think that's pretty huge. Her other collections include A Spaceship Built of Stone and Other Stories, 1987, Memories of the Body, Tales of Desire and Transformation, 1992, Ghosts and Other Lovers, 2002, and Objects and Dreams, 2012. A number of her stories have appeared in Best of the Year anthologies and been nominated for awards. Closet Dreams won the 2007 International Horror Guild Award. She edited an influential anthology of horror stories by women writers, Skin of the Soul, first published in 1990. Born and raised in Texas, educated in New York, later a resident of London, she now makes her home in a remote rural part of Scotland. And I've just been listening to your accent, and it is fascinating, by the way, because I can hear traces of all of those places. So I noticed when I was doing a little more digging around in you online that you, when you were growing up in Texas, you were kind of active in science fiction fandom.
Yes.
And
yes.
you even edited a fanzine. So who were some of the authors that really influenced you and got you wanting to get that involved early on?
Well, I'd say probably my favorite writers. Can everyone hear me? Am I speaking into the, okay. Ray Bradbury was a huge, Theodore Sturgeon, Philip K. Dick, although the first book I bought by Philip K. Dick, because it had a quote from Theodore Sturgeon. So I thought, well, Theodore Sturgeon, it's good enough for me. Zena Henderson, I love the stories of the people. Yeah. I liked Robert A. Heinlein's Juveniles. Mm-hmm. Other writers that were, there was British Edwardian writer E. Nesbit, famous fantasy writer. I loved The Five Children of It, The Amulet. Anyway, all these wonderful fantasies set in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of British writers were, but this was in kind of children's books. But science fiction was the names I've said. And it was just, I suppose, once I realized that the kind of literature I liked the most had a particular, that a lot of it was called science fiction. And there were these magazines. In fact, my father had a subscription to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So I was reading, even when I was quite young, stories, if they were short enough. You know, I'd be attracted by the covers, and I'd read maybe a short story, but I wouldn't read anything too long. So by the time I was in my teens, I had discovered there was this thing called fandom because of the letter columns in the magazines where people would write in and they'd mention conventions, or they would, there was the National Fantasy Fan Federation. May have been complete, I don't know if it's still going or if it's been forgotten, but the N3F, someone wrote a letter into one of the magazines and mentioned it and said they're looking for members. And I thought, wow. So I wrote off, became a member, discovered that they would try and put you in touch with other fans that lived near you. Well, there didn't seem to be any other members of the N3F in Houston at that time. However, there were 2 other people living in kind of South Texas, generally. So they gave me their addresses. We wrote to each other. This was before the internet, of course, so it takes a little longer. But then one of them told me that comic book fans were often science fiction fans as well. And there was a comic collectors association in Houston. So I got my dad to take me to a meeting, you know, in the evening downtown, the YMCA. Wow. something. I walk in, there's only one other female face in the room. It was a mother of one of the people. So anyway, I was 15 or 14, whatever. Anyway, so I did get involved in even though I wasn't a big comic fan, I occasionally I'd read anything, you know. But I then discovered through that there were these kind of weird comics, you know, EC and all that kind of stuff. That's really cool. And I found, yes, there were some people there that they read science fiction, and they sometimes rented science fiction movies or the old serials like Flash Gordon. And so I don't even remember exactly how it happened, whether somebody said it or whether I just thought, well, if there isn't a Houston Science Fiction Society, there ought to be. So I started one. And I had some people from the Comic Society came, and I enlisted my friends from school, which is why the HSFS was well known for a time as being, wow, they've got all these girls. Because this was such a boy thing. You know? But we were about half and half. And it was because it was my friends at school. They maybe never thought of being science fiction fans, but yeah, they read, you know, they read all sorts of things, and they were interested, they'd come along. So anyway, so that was it, and I was always interested in kind of in publishing, and so fanzines, great. So the Houston Science Fiction Society, and my father had not Ditto, it was a
Mimeograph?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that was, did you type stencils?
Yes.
Yeah, that
and
was
then you
it.
could like get high up and smell.
Oh, the smell, the correction fluid, and the smell of, yes, old technology. But anyway, it was great. So I remember that wonderful thing of typing stencils and making the corrections. And anyway, so we published, I think I was the editor for maybe 4 or 5 issues. It's called Matham, which is a word from Tolkien. Which just meant something like, I can't remember. Diane, do you remember what Matham means?
Oh gosh.
It's something like an interesting object of no real value or something like that. You know? So that was kind of the idea of what this fanzine would be. Right. So, and also the other good thing about publishing a fanzine was you could trade with other people and get their fanzines for free. And you could then, once you were kind of in a trading relationship, I could then send them a story and they might read it. And then there was no money in it, but people would read it. They would write letters. I mean, it was great. That was my kind of first taste of, you know, of being published. It was a small audience, but people would respond. You'd get 3 or 4 letters where they talk about your story and say what they liked about it, how, you know, better than other stories they'd read, or not as good as, you know, or almost good enough to be published in a real magazine. You know, so
Do you still have any of those fanzines?
I do.
Oh,
I have my little archive file.
Yeah. Do other people ever come up to you at signings with any of them?
No. Although, I'm trying to think, there was one issue, I was working, well, there was I can't remember exactly how this happened, but somehow or other, I think I was doing something for Pacifica Radio, which was, there was going to be a Janis Joplin concert, and they gave us a stack of, I had this stack of these little flyers. They looked like a bourbon bottle, and it gave the time and the date, and Houston Coliseum or wherever. And so I had so many of them, and I didn't have many outlets, you know, to kind of give away these things. So I put one into every issue of the magazine. And there was still a stack of them. When my parents moved house about 25 years ago, they just had a stack that they were clearing out, you know, so they had a stack and they had a garage sale. And so she said, there were just a few, maybe 4 or 5. And she said, one man came up and he said, how much for these women? I said, oh, you can have them. And he said, do you have any more things like this? So suddenly I realized, ooh, this is like collectible. So I thought, well, I still have a few in my old copies of Matham.
And it's interesting that you would bring up Sturgeon and Bradbury, who were also 2 of the authors I most read as a kid. And I think I came to Sturgeon through Star Trek. It was one of those things where I was very young watching Star Trek, and I'd say, wow, I love this episode. And I'd go look up the writer and read their work and say, this guy's incredible. And Bradbury and Sturgeon were 2 guys who wrote in different genres.
Yes.
And I think maybe some of my first introduction to horror, when I probably even like 9 or 10 years old, were things like Something Wicked by Bradbury, and one that really totally changed my mindset, I think, was Sturgeon's Some of Your Blood.
Oh yes. Oh yes. I remember yeah, the impact of that book.
Right.
I remember reading that. Wow. Yeah.
So I assume with those authors probably kind of influenced you in several directions.
I think so, yeah. And I think the other thing is back in those days, there really wasn't a genre known as horror.
Right.
And yet a lot of my early stories, I mean, although I was kind of identified as a science fiction writer, that was the overarching genre. Everybody in the 70s, early 70s,
right.
if you were writing and selling, it was science fiction. You might be writing a fantasy story, or you might be writing, I mean, my first few sales were actually horror stories. But, you know, they went either to an anthology or they would go to magazine fantasy and science fiction. And I did sometimes get stories rejected because they'd say, we're a science fiction magazine, this isn't science fiction. So it was just, I wrote the kind of things, you know, you can only write what you can write, you know, what ideas came to me. And they tended to be more on the darker fantasy side. And I loved, I mean, one of the things about, well, both Sturgeon and Bradbury was a lot of they might be called science fiction, set on another planet. But really, these days, I think you can see it more as fantasy. It was just, that was how they were marketed.
Right.
They were labeled.
Something like More Than Human by Sturgeon is, you know, there's almost no science fiction trappings in that.
Yeah, but it's an idea. I mean, there is an idea, I suppose. Yeah, so it isn't like just fantasy. It's not like, oh, this just magically happens. Right. That was the whole kind of gestalt idea. Ooh, do we really want it, though?
Yeah. This is a weird thing. This hotel apparently has all of these different rooms on one motherboard. So if they change the lights in the film room next door, we get it in all of those panels.
Oh, I wondered what was happening.
Yeah, and you know, we were trying to
yeah, we figure out what it was. Yeah. The haunted room.
And I noticed that one of the interviews or something with you mentioned how influenced you are by ghost stories.
Oh, yes.
And I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the ghost stories you might have read when you were young that you said, oh, I'm going to do that.
Well, that was, I mean, I think a lot of kids are really, you know, oh, tell me something scary. I mean, you must remember, I mean, I'm sure there's some kids that don't like to be scared. Right. There must be some. But, I mean, one of my memories of kind of was sitting in a closet with, like, my sister, my best friend, and her sister, who would get too freaked out, so we'd have to make her leave. She was going to get too scared and not in a good way. And kind of, it's like once you ran out of the few stories you'd read or seen something on TV or read in a comic book or something, you know, I would start making stuff up.
Right.
And I loved, I mean, or I would retell things that I'd read, because my father had a couple of anthologies. I remember one was called Great Ghost Stories of the World. And there was one like an omnibus of the supernatural, I think. And there was, I don't know, he had at least 3. They were all big, fat collections of just everything. You know, I mean, that was where I read Saki and Arthur Machen and M.R. James and Edith Wharton and Oliver Onions, I guess, or Onions it looks like, but J.S. Le Fanu, as well as, I mean, he also had collections of like O. Henry and Saki, you know, because when they're short. He also had the complete works of Charles Fort. Although I came to that a little bit later because I couldn't quite make head or tail of it when I was really young, and you don't want to read a complete story. Reading this Charles Fort is just weird.
Yeah.
Just one thing after another. A woman turns into a swan, or there's
and he says it's real.
A downfall. Yeah, there's a storm of frogs, and very odd. But so that was really, I loved those stories, and that was, so I always knew, before I even had ever heard of science fiction or knew there was, and I also loved children's fantasy. You know, I liked stories. That was my favorite thing, was really not otherworldly stories, you know, not the kind of Tolkien Middle Earth. What I liked was you start off, you're in the real world, you've got people, you've got a normal situation, and then something really weird happens.
Right.
Now, whether it's a ghost, or whether it's children find a little coin and they discover they can make wishes on it, you know, or whether, I just loved everything like that.
Did you ever do that thing a lot of us started off with, which is where you, when you're, you know, a kid, maybe 12, 13, something like that, and you start writing, and you start off by kind of imitating other authors?
Absolutely, absolutely. I definitely I tried to write Ray Bradbury type stories every time, and I'm definitely trying to do that. I don't think I tried to write a Sturgeon story because I didn't know how.
Right.
You know, it's just kind of, But Bradbury had a particular voice and that kind of poetic,
Yes.
and the kind of also it was Midwest. Well, not from the Midwest, but my parents were from the Midwest.
Right.
So it's that kind of American childhood, and so that kind of thing. Who else did I try and write like? Well, when I was really young, it was kind of like whatever book I read, I would try and write something. I was always I would start books. There would be books, but I rarely got past chapter 1.
Right.
I also wrote Man from Uncle stories.
Awesome.
And I may even have written some Star Trek stories.
Wow.
Because that's the thing, something on TV was really good, and you think, oh, I want to have more adventures.
Yes.
These characters.
Yes.
So.
I wrote Logan's Run stories.
Come on.
And the fanzine, right?
Say what?
And the fanzine.
Yes. Yeah. Now, you started writing science fiction, and you were breaking into that genre in the 70s. And what was it like then? Do you think it was maybe in some ways easier, harder than it is now to break into that, especially as a female author?
Oh, well, I think, my memory of the early 70s was like it was great to be a woman writer.
Okay.
Because like people were saying, wow, the best science fiction is coming out from women.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I certainly never encountered any feeling that women couldn't write science fiction, because that was and there wasn't, as I say, really a horror market. So whenever I write one of these kind of scary stories, it was like, well, where can I sell it?
Yeah.
It's sort of harder. I don't know if it's harder. In some ways, I think now there are more options because of there's a lot of magazines online. There's a lot of new markets, but they do tend to be. I guess they're not necessarily as immediately visible. There weren't as many markets then, but it's kind of, you knew there were, 4 magazines, and there were also fanzines. That was the thing, you wouldn't get paid, but I suppose that's a bit like now online.
Right.
You might just publish something, see how people, yourself, and then it's a matter of getting the word out,
Right.
for people to hear about it. So whether I don't know if it's different.
Yeah.
I think totally different, and I really don't, I wouldn't know. I suspect if I was starting now, I probably would start a blog. That's probably what I would do, or something. Because that's, something like that.
Right, fan fiction that becomes 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have to ask about collaborating with George R.R. Martin. How did the collaboration with him work? And was it, was collaborating with anyone something that you haven't done a lot of collaboration?
No, but when I started out, this was a kind of, I don't know, I guess it was just, we were all young writers.
Right.
We all were kind of like, we just wanted to write. We wanted to talk about writing. It was Turkey City started, that was a writers group that I was one of the people that started it. And although George was not a Texan, the way we originally met was he was kind of pen pals with Howard Waldron.
Oh, right.
And they were both comic fans, and they were corresponding. Of course, this isn't again, didn't have the internet. You went to conventions, but people were scattered around, and if you made a friend and they lived, hundreds of miles away, you couldn't see them very often, but you wrote letters to each other.
Right.
And phone calls were expensive. So I met George at a convention in Dallas, and we were both, he'd had maybe, I think I'd had like about 3 stories published, maybe I'd sold 2 more. George had maybe 5 or 6 stories published.
Right.
But we've both been nominated for the John W. Campbell Award, Best New Science Fiction Writer of the Year. And the actual person who won it turned out to be Jerry Cornell. And I don't know, George and I think neither of us really thought we had much of a chance, but it was a kind of like a jokey thing that, we're competitive,
Right.
one of us must die, so when we were introduced. But we really hit it off, and it was just that thing. We were just a lot of young writers, and we were talking. And so I did collaborate with quite a lot of people. Well, not quite a lot, actually. Steve Utley, Joe Pamelia. We even wrote stories where there would be like 5 of us all contributing.
Right.
And this would just come out of like a late night, sitting around, one typewriter. Somebody would sit down, Steve Utley would sit and type a line, and then go, okay, Howard, your turn. And then Howard Walbert would sit down until he did, Most of the ones, frankly, if you get more than 2 writers, most of them were pretty awful. If it was 2 writers, you could manage, sort of back and forth. They were fairly short. But I'd written, I think 2 stories with Steve Utley. And George and I were corresponding, and I told him about, oh, we've just sold this story. And I wrote back, because I recently reread this letter, I dug it out, and he was saying, you have got to stop collaborating with that Steve Utley. He'll corrupt you. You must collaborate with me. He said, we will write a story that will win awards, Lisa, I promise you. So I wrote back. I don't have my letter, what I actually said, but I basically said, okay, fine. And but what my rules were, it had to be a story that would sell to Analog magazine. Because that was the hard science fiction magazine. George had sold Analog. I had not. I didn't write the kind of stories that could do it, but I kind of fancied the idea. You know, if I could write something that wasn't seen as fantasy or horror or not quite science fiction or kind of like poetic science, you know, I want to write something, wow, that's a real science fiction story. So I said, okay, it has to be real science fiction that we can sell to Analog. And he said, okay. And he sent me he said, I will look into my idea file. And he said, I warn you, these are not actual stories. They are just vague little, they were really more like settings, or, you know, kind of a notion that would be. So he sent me two. One of them was kind of about these humans that have been viewed in the future where people have been genetically modified and could live undersea. And I forget what, it probably didn't have a story, it was just sort of, that was the situation. Oh, I think the situation was probably something like people were leaving the planet, but these people that had been transferred couldn't, because they couldn't go on a spaceship or whatever. Oh, you could, fill it with water. I don't know. Anyway, that was one idea. And the other one was on a planet where, lighter than Earth gravity, but it was a kind of lost colony. And the people there were now back to an earlier technological era, because they'd been cut off from the rest of the universe. But what they'd done to adapt, in a way, was it was a solar-powered ship with a huge sail. And so they'd taken that and cannibalized the ship and made these really great wings so they could fly on the lighter gravity, you know, whether it really worked. I don't know, but that was basically in this a world of tiny little islands dotted around in a very stormy sea with really strong winds and kind of monsters in the sea. So ship travel was pretty dangerous. So actually flying was dangerous too, but less dangerous. So this was the background. But there were a limited supply of wings, and so it was kind of, you know, maybe it would be a hereditary passing down of wings. What happens if someone wants to break in? So what I put into that was I really loved the idea of writing a story about flying. I thought that would be great. And what I brought to it was, well, I didn't want it to be, I wanted the main character to be a woman, but I didn't want her to be the typical, oh, well, women are oppressed and trying, you know, men get to do this. So I thought, no, women and men will both equally be flyers. But it can be a family thing. She's not born into a flyer family. How does she do? So she somehow, you know, so anyway, so that was the beginning. And I began it. I wrote first, 10 pages, 8 pages, something like that, sent it off to him. He loved it, charged on ahead, sent it back to me. This was a slow process, you know, because he was living in Chicago. I was first, I think I was in Syracuse, where I was at University. And then, what? I hadn't left yet when we started dorms. Yep. Because then I graduated, and then I went out and stayed at Harlan Ellison's house. Oh, I was one of his. Wow. I was one of his proteges. Yeah. And George at that time was working part-time he ran chess tournaments at weekends, so he got free travel. So he got to do one in LA. So he said, "Great, come see me." So at that point, we did finish the story. At that point, we were able to actually end it in one place, two of us together, talking about it, how we're going to end this story. And sent it off to Ben Bova. Ben Bova, who was the editor of Analog, said, I love the world, I love the situation, but you've set up this great conflict and then you resolve it by having people have a reasonable argument and behave reasonably. But this just isn't very exciting. He said, I think it's going to have to be longer. And, you know, and of course he was right, because it was like, we're going, whoa, the story's going on a bit. So they do. She just makes a good argument, they agree. Okay, so it became a novella instead of a short story. And once we'd written the novella, we did sell it to Analog, and we got a lot of reader response. People really liked it. There were even book editors were kind of, oh, we had suggestions. It could be a young adult novel, or it could be, we were thinking more a series of stories. And so for a while, we weren't quite sure what we were going to do, and then plus we were both going off in different directions, and George began to write his first novel, and so it was some years passed before we wrote the second story. By that time, we had decided we'll make the second story 7 years later to see what's happened to the world. Wrote that, and once we've done that, it's like, wow, we have like, that's nearly a book. So we, so then we decided, okay, then there'll be a third story, and that'll round it off as a novel. So, and then we sold it.
And it's been in print almost ever since.
It has. There's been a lot of editions, there's been a lot of translations of it, and this was even before George was as, stratospherically famous. But we've even recently, now that George is stratospherically famous, of course, we've even sold it like again in places like Spain, new translation, Russia, new translation, Italy, new translation, where it had come out years, back in the 80s, and now they were kind of like, well, let's revisit this. This is yet another one. George R. R. Martin. And Lisa Tuttle. But in the contract, George, there's always this thing about must equal prominence to the two names.
Very nice.
Because this is not, I was not just helping you.
Right.
This wasn't like, because at the time, yes, George was better known than me because it was his second novel.
Okay.
Whereas it was my first novel.
So, I never heard about Harlan Ellison.
Oh, yes. Well, Harlan taught at Clarion. I'm a Clarion alumni of back in the early days. So I met Harlan. Well, actually, I met him before that because he came to a convention in Texas. And I'd written him a fan letter. I'd read it was Dangerous Visions. I went and saved up my money and bought a copy of Dangerous Visions, and I wrote him a letter and said what a great book it was. And he sent me a copy of one of his, I Have No Mouth and On the Screen. And autographed to me, and sounds nice. So we had, and so when he came to Texas, I met him with a group of other fans. He came to my house. My mother made meatballs and all kinds of little snacks, and it was like cool. And then, but we didn't really stay in touch. And then, I went on. I kind of got a little older, went off to college, and then went to Clarion. I was 18. And and suddenly Harlan walks in and he goes, I know you. Right? I said, yes, I didn't think he'd remember me, but of course I remember you. And he did. So, and then he was impressed by my writing. And it was me and Arthur Byron Cover, I think were two that he kind of singled out, I guess, that particular year and invited us both to come out to LA. He even tried to talk me into dropping out of college, moving out to LA. My mother would have killed it. I think. Anyway, and said, always have a place to stay. And I did. I spent about 6 months out there, ran out of money, but then thought, God, I'm going to be living in LA, and so went to Texas, shared an apartment with Diane, and got a job on a newspaper, and settled in Austin for a while.
I'm 6 months in LA and you're around Harlan Ellison and all that. I mean, did the idea of screenwriting ever cross your mind?
Well, at different times in my life, I've thought of that, and people have raised it. In fact, George tried to talk me into it at one point when he was doing Beauty and the Beast. My mind just didn't seem to work in that way. I just, I think what I could do, I've since, in more recent years, I've done treatments of books of my own, and I've just recently written my first play. It's very short. But, now I would do it, but when I had the opportunity, I just couldn't do it.
Right.
People suggested it, and I just felt, well, my mind works. I like books and short stories. And, it's print, prose, that's me. It's like, how do I write poetry? How do I write screenplay? I don't know. It was just kind of,
And you were kind of doing young adult before that whole genre exploded.
Yeah, they were really only published in Britain. It was, I'm trying to remember how. Oh, I wrote a story. Diana Jones bought a story from me. I think she may have, or was it Jane Yolen? Well, both of them, actually. I wrote a story for Jane Yolen Anthology, and they both wrote to me and asked me for a story, and I did. And I think it was the one in the Diana Wynne Jones anthology that the editor at the publishing house really liked it and asked for my address and wrote to me or phoned me or something and just said, have you thought of writing for children? And I said, well, no. Well, yes. I said, well, when I was younger, because I loved books when I was a kid, and I always thought that when I grew up I would write books for kids. But I don't know. And she said, well, if you're in London, by this time I was living in Scotland, next time you're in London, let me take you out to lunch. Oh, what better excuse to go to London? I immediately made plans to go to London. And she took me out to lunch. We were talking. she was just so receptive. I suppose it's really lovely when you get an editor who's likes everything you're saying. And so I had this kind of vague idea. I didn't know if it would be a story or book, and I just told it to her. And she said, "That's great, I want to buy it." And I said, "Really?" And I said, "I find it really hard to do outlines." She said, "You don't have to do an outline. What you've told me, just write, you have to write something so I can show it, to bring it to a meeting. Just a page or paragraph, just like you've told it to me." And I said, because I said, I also don't know how it ends, And so I did, and that became a book called A Panther in Argyle. And it's sort of, I feel, it is a YA, but it's kind of, I feel like most of the YAs now are really for sort of older teens.
Right.
And this was more thinking of my own, the kind of thing I would have liked to read when I was about 12,
right.
I guess. So, there's no real romance. I mean, there is a boy and girl relationship, but there's no romance. It's not all about, who am I going to get involved with? It's not about love and sex. But it is about growing up, and it's about, also about shape-shifting and transformation, and it's this, Black Panther, which was inspired by, people do see, there are sightings of this big black cat in the area where I live in Scotland, as there are in many other places.
Right.
And shortly after I moved up there, there'd been a headline in a local paper about it, and that was what sparked the idea of the story, or the novel. So that was the first, but it never sold in America. Although my agent really liked it, and I recently, a friend of mine who's a now retired editor, read it. She'd never read it. She said, "I didn't know you wrote this book as well. Never published in America." She read it. She said, "Oh, do you want me to go and talk to some people?" I said, "Well," I went and looked at my files. Well, actually, my agent did send it out to a lot of places. And it was either, in some cases they said it was too British. In others it was, well, they really liked it, but it didn't somehow fit their list. They weren't looking for that type of fantasy. I don't know. Anyway, so it never, so it's kind of, however, it was reprinted more than once. It was brought out with a different cover in the UK. So, and it's enduringly popular in Argyle, where I live, right? And unfortunately it's out of print, but it is now available as an ebook.
Oh,
because Joe Fletcher books, she sort of bought my whole backlist. So they're all available as ebooks, at least in the UK.
Excellent. It seems like now with the the explosion in that, now we have both YA and middle grade stuff.
Yeah. This might be more middle grade, I think. It's kind of the older end of that, but it's, and even teens. Some adults sometimes read it and go, "I like that."
Of course.
Story. But it is about kind of, I can't remember whether I actually tell you what her age is, the main character, but she's sort of around, 14. So she's 13, 14, I can't remember. It's been a while since I read it.
It's interesting that you said that certain American editors thought it was too British, because that was one of my next questions here was going to be all these different places that you've lived, going from Texas to New York to London to Scotland, and I just wondered how they have influenced what you've written.
Well, I think Britain, both England and Scotland, have had a big influence on me. And for a long time, though, there was that difficulty where I'm an American. I'm writing about American characters, but more and more they're living in Britain. And it took a long time. I now feel more comfortable writing that I can write about a character who might be English or Scottish. But for a long time, it's just, it's that weird transatlantic expat thing,
Interesting, because it seems like it's almost, looking at your bios and so forth, it almost seems like you wrote a lot of the sort of more science fiction-y stuff before you crossed the Atlantic, and then it turned into sort of more the slightly supernatural, dark fantasy stuff.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah. I don't know why. I do think I've been sort of inspired by, in a way, by the landscape, particularly in Scotland.
And you, in 1990, you edited an interesting anthology called Skin of the Soul, New Horror Stories by Women. And there's a kind of debate that goes on among some of my editor friends and so forth about women-only anthologies. I know a few of my editor friends think it's almost a form of literary segregation.
Ghettoization.
And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, my feeling, the reason for that book was when I read Primeval, edited by Douglas Winter, who wrote an introduction, which I was in agreement with, which is, you know, horror is found in all literature. It shouldn't just be seen as a genre. It's an emotion, not a genre. I know some people argue against that nowadays. It seems to be going back to the genre idea. But, and I thought, yes, I agree. And all the examples he gave are of male writers, except with one exception. Now, that exception was not Mary Shelley. It was not Edith Wharton. It was not Shirley Jackson. It was not Anne Rice. It was V.C. Andrews. Which made me wonder if he even knew V.C. Andrews was a woman.
Right.
And every single author in that book, which was invitational, everyone he invited, well, as far as I know, he may have invited some women who said no.
Yeah.
I didn't get invited. I didn't know any other woman who was invited.
Yeah.
They were all men. And it wasn't just they were the biggest names. Yes, he did get the big names, but he also invited a few lesser known, newer male writers. Fair enough, it's his choice, but it really outraged me. I just felt, where does he live? You know, does he live in this kind of little Casbah where women are kept separate and they don't take part? It's just so bizarre. When was that? That was like 1988, 89, 90? I don't know. What is this? Anyway, so I thought, I had this fantasy, my revenge fantasy of the publisher, which was that I would sell a book, an anthology, and it wouldn't be anything about, I wouldn't say women, and I would write this introduction about, you know, all these great new writers and all these, and everybody I mentioned, all the examples would all be women, and everybody I invited would be women, but I would never say, except, of course, then when it came down to actually, I mentioned this to someone who said, you ought to do it, and you could do it for the Women's Press. I thought, well, there goes that idea. Yeah, I can write this. If I write for the Women's Press, they only publish books by women, so okay, let's just say this is a celebration of women writing horror.
Right.
So it became something a little different. But really, I'm of two minds about the women only. The other thing is, at the time, I think there was at least one book of horror stories by women that had been published, but it was edited by a man.
Oh, okay.
It was Alan J. Ryan, called Haunting Women. And there were some good stories in the reprint anthology. But I don't think there was any, but I just really, you know, I still regret that I couldn't do it, you know, as a jape. And then see the reviews.
Yeah, right.
Why isn't there a story about Peter Straub? Why isn't there a story? Why don't you mention Stephen King? I don't get it. Where does she live? But instead, you know, it was a Women's Press thing, but still, then it was published by Pocket Books in America.
Right, okay.
So that was good. So it got a mainstream and a bigger advance because I could offer so little money.
Right.
So Women's Press, and I did have a few writers turn me down, and that was why I did end up with a couple of reprints because I just couldn't come up with money. However, it was wonderful when it sold to America, and then I was able to send everybody another check.
Right. One of my favorite stories of yours I want to single out and talk about is Closet Dreams. It was nominated for the 2007 Bram Stoker Award, as well as winning the International Horror Guild Award. And it was kind of the story that I read, and I went, oh, damn, I hate this woman, and this is so good. So I just wondered if we could talk a little about it. It was funny that you mentioned growing up in, like, sitting in a closet and reading ghost stories, and I immediately went to that.
Yeah.
Is there anything to that?
There is a connection to the closet. That story, you know, it's great. I mean, I wrote that story, and I was really nervous about it because it's a dream story. And there's that thing, I mean, okay, Occurrence at Elk Creek Bridge, people would agree is a classic, but mostly, if you write a story like that, people might get mad at you, or they might feel that you cheated them, okay? So I wrote this story, and then I went to the World Fantasy Convention in Austin. I wrote the story in 2006. I took the story with me. No one else had read it, and I did it for my reading. And I was so nervous because I was thinking, oh, they might hate it, but I hope they'll be kind to me. And when I got to the end, there was this around the room. Right. And I just thought that was the best feeling. I'd horrified it. And it was like, I thought, oh, it's good. And so then I sold it, and yeah, as you say, and people, and I mean, I think it is a very powerful story. It's a very nasty story.
Well, one of the things that I love about that story is it works on so many levels. You know, on the surface, it's about a woman who has been kidnapped and has been held captive in a closet. She's a young woman as the story begins. And she is in the closet for several months, and she has escaped, and she's recounting her time in this closet now. She never really saw her captor and doesn't know where she was held, and is trying to give the police details and all this, and she's working through it. And there's a way that this story was approached that makes it almost seem like you're writing about, in some ways, a bigger cell that a lot of women are kept in. And I found that very powerful. At the ending, this is one of the great twist endings of all time. No spoilers. I'm not giving that away. Go read this story. You can get it as an ebook single, right? A little single.
I think it is.
Yeah, Infinity Plus or something.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's well worth your mere 99 cents to get this. It's really great.
But it was in some of the best of the year.
Yeah.
But it also, I mean, the closet thing was when I was growing up in Houston. In my closet as a child, there was this little, what looked to me like a door,
right?
And it was with duct tape around it, and I was fascinated by it. I remember I kept asking about it, and I'm like, it's just the pipes behind there. I don't know, somehow in my mind I thought, no, there'd be a little tunnel to somewhere. I mean, I just loved, you know, this was a little door, and so that was part of what fed into the story. But it was interesting, I was trying to think I don't actually know if there was a case that inspired it, because years after the story was published was when the Joseph Fritzl, that was in 2009. I wrote the story in 2006.
Oh, interesting.
It was in 2009 yeah. So I'm trying to remember, and I'm thinking, I mean, Emma Donoghue, who wrote The Room, which is a wonderful book, which was inspired, I think, partly by the Fritzl case. Right. But that was, you know, again, that was like 2011 or something, or 12, whatever. Anyway, so I don't know if there was a case in the news, or whether men do kidnap women and girls and keep them prisoner for their warped reasons. So I don't know whether there was I was trying to remember, and every case I could think of all turned out after the story. You know, I mean, obviously they were going on at the time, but they were not revealed until. So I don't know.
Well, since we've just got a couple of minutes left, did anybody here have a question or comment? Yes, Mr. Palazzo.
Yeah. What inspired the move to Scotland, and how has that changed your entire outlook?
It has changed my life. That was 25 years ago, though. Okay. It was love, and my intended we wanted to move away from London because we couldn't really afford. He sold his flat, and we were then living in a rented flat, and we couldn't really afford to buy anywhere in the kind of greater London area. It's worse than New York, you know. And he'd always had this kind of love for Scotland. And so we went, in fact, what surprises me is he sometimes said, I can't believe we've been here for 25 years. I didn't think we'd come here for that long. I thought, really? I thought we were moving up there for good, you know, putting down roots. He just thought, let's go live there for a few years and then we'll see. Anyway, so it was partly, I guess, financial, somewhere we could afford to live, and partly, let's go live somewhere beautiful, in the country, not in a city, so that was it.
Anybody else? See if did I come up with a brilliant closing question?
What are you working on now?
Well, right now, I've just finished a draft, but I've got to go back, as soon as we get home, I finally got the notes from my editor. So it's a novel. It's called The Curious Affair of the Somnambulist and the Psychic Thief. And it's set in the 1890s in London. It's about a pair of detectives, and the case involves missing mediums, and a man who seems to have really amazing powers, and all kinds of strange things.
Does it sort of deal with the whole spiritual?
It does, yeah. There's a bit of spiritualism, and a bit of psychic phenomenon, and there's going to be more. It's the first, I've written 2 stories about these characters, and that was what kind of people reading, wow, you got to do a novel about these characters, and so I did, and the idea is this will be the first book, then there's going to be a second one, but so when I get home, I've got to do a bit of work on it still.
Who's the publisher?
It's Joe Fletcher Books in Britain, and I'm hoping to sell it here, but until I've got it absolutely right, then my agent will hopefully sell it here as well. That would be nice.
So they could push it as steampunk, and you have yet another genre.
Yeah, it's not like steampunk because there's no kind of like mechanical objects. There could be in the second book, though. We could do that.
I'll just close with one last question I had, which was, I know you have taught creative writing, and what is like the #1 thing you tell new writers?
Oh, that's such a hard question, because I was thinking, like, I can tell you 10 things.
Right.
No, well, I don't know, I mean, the main thing, it depends on the person, really. But I think the main thing is, well, if you want to write, and you feel you have to write, it's write.
Right.
And, you know, and then it's good to get feedback. So either go take a class or join a writer's group or try and get some kind of feedback, because you can be very blind to your own faults, and, you know, until you have somebody else. But it has to be somebody you trust. It can't just be like a person who loves you and just says everything you write is wonderful,
Right.
you know. So, right, and reading. That's the other big thing, because, I mean, it amazes me, but I do occasionally meet them. It's people who say, I really want to be a writer, and you ask them what they read, and they don't actually read that much, you know. So reading a lot, I think, is important. Not to copy, but just to read, you know. If you're going to write, you ought to read.
Yeah. You know,
Right, I guess I'm too.
they're not cleaning to throw us out yet. I'm going to ask a couple more.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting that your nonfiction has all been sort of feminism-based,
Yep.
which is kind of a big deal for me, too. And in 1986, you wrote something called the Encyclopedia of Feminism.
Yep.
Which is awesome. That kind of wanted to bring me back to something like, is the situation getting better for women and women writers?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I think, on the one hand, I always think, yeah, things are improving, and then on the other hand, you've got the internet.
Right.
You know, and I mean, the whole idea, you know, why is it a woman says anything and a rape threat seems to be the default response from some people? I mean, and is that just because of the internet? You know, would they say anything like that? You know, I don't know. So it worries me. I do think women are stronger, women have a better position in society, so I think there has been a change for the better. But there are just there's still work to be done, and,
Right.
you know, there's still problems, or new problems, you know,
Yeah.
to replace the ones, we got rid of that, okay, that's not a problem. Oh, something else has popped up in its place.
Yeah, it seems like the sort of people who might have been just on the edge and relegated to a corner in the past now have that shield of anonymity in the internet.
I just said trolls.
Trolls,
Yeah. So you go back under the bridge.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's about all I had. I had forgot to give out, we have the Lisa Tuttle collectible bookmarks.
Excellent, thank you.
Which one?